We're just repping Poland brand.
Our corporate sponsor.
Not the vibe. We're
Okay, we are live. And go. So everyone's visible. Voila.
Hi, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm a volunteer here, so I'll just do some housekeeping stuff. I'll read my script and then I'll pass it over. So hello, everybody. Welcome to Peer Review, a queer publishing roundtable presented by WUSSY Mag and the Bureau. I'm Tannen Reckling, a volunteer and also organizer of the current exhibition in the space. WUSSY's Networking Some Queer Sensibilities. It's around the room. Just to keep a couple brief housekeeping notes here. So there's a gender neutral restroom on this floor down the hall. On the right, as you exit this room here down the hall. Events at the Bureau are always free and open to the public. That being said, the Bureau is a volunteer-run space, so we ask for donations to support the work we do. The suggested donation is $10, but please give what you can if you can. You can always make a one-time tax-deductible donation or sign up to make a monthly donation by visiting our website and selecting donate from the menu. There's a bag somewhere.
You can also give on Venmo at BGSQD, the letters, but all of them. In many ways.
True, and we're passing around a bag. Feel free to have it make its way back there eventually. Let's see, another way to support us is to purchase books, obviously, publications and other merchandise. Thank you for your support, whatever it takes. That bag will be making its way back. Let's see here. We're happy that so many of you could join us here today. Please make yourself comfortable as you can. I know it's getting a little hot in here as well, a little cramped. So please offer a seat if you can, and lean into, if someone needs to get up and use the restroom, we can lean into that and get comfortable in this space. So personally, a huge thank you to Greg and Donnie, who founded the Bureau in 2012 and have operated it with the help of many volunteers ever since. In these precarious times, it's so important to advocate for and support queer and activist spaces, given how challenging it is to operate a space centering our communities rather than profit. Speaking at this point, we're gathering during a difficult week. We did lose trans mother and legendary advocate Cecilia Gentilia this week, as we all know. Her book Faltas is actually right there. It's available here. And if we run out, please contact us if you would like a copy. The Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee and Lenape. We encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community Houses Manhattan Fund as well. According to their website, it's an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that compromise the history of our city and United States itself. We also want to recognize today is the 127th day of Israel's genocidal campaign against the Palestinian people, funded by our tax dollars and enabled by our government's unwavering support. We hope you all will join us in calling for an immediate ceasefire. Let's see, next week, the Bureau will host an event titled, you might have seen it online, Watermelon Pink, the crossroads of queerness and Arabness through the lens of Palestine. So this is happening on Thursday, February 15th at 7:30 p.m. This will take place in person here, but we're also expecting a huge crowd. So when we reach capacity, you can watch it on our live stream, but also in person in another room as well. Let's see. To finish, I'll read an excerpt from our wall text kind of over there about maybe through lines that we'll all kind of get to today in the panel. So things just seem more and more off, don't they? How are queers meant to connect during hard times? In 2024, when governmental bodies are doubling down on normalizing harm, engaging these topics matters, especially for those of us safely away in urban centers. So this exhibition doesn't have all the answers, but we're gathering here to sort of celebrate and support the ongoing labor that we all benefit from in the end. And I think that's everything. So I'll pass it over now. Join me in welcoming the panel.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Tannen, so much for that beautiful introduction. Thank you, Greg, for having us, the Bureau and the Center, and you all for being here, and these beautiful panelists. I'm excited to get into it. I'm Rachel Garbus. I'm the editor-in-chief of WUSSY Mag. We are a queer culture rag and media outfit based in Atlanta, Georgia. So we're really excited to be here for the weekend and have this conversation with all these really wonderful people. We were started by the lovely John Dean over here back in 2013, 2014, or 2015, depending on which stage of the development you're at. So we've been around for about 10 years. We publish a biannual print magazine. Some of our covers are up here twice a year. We also host podcasts. We do a lot of events in Atlanta, and we're excited to be hosting a party in Brooklyn tonight. We'll hope you'll join us at Come On Everybody. Mel Forever is hosting with us. It starts 11 p.m., which is past some of our bedtimes, including mine sometimes, but we're making it happen. We're drinking the Red Bulls. We're staying till 4 a.m. Please join us. So yeah, we're really excited to be here. We are also fundraising. Thank you. We're independent publishing and bookstores are always scrappy and trying hard to survive. So we are also launching a fundraiser for volume 13, which will be our issue slated for this spring. We're going to be launching a bigger fundraiser, but you can donate Venmo or Cash App at WUSSY Mag. We'd love your support in making it happen. We are a 100% independent queer publishing outfit, and we care a lot about putting queer voices out there from all over the world, queer art. So thank you all for your support in the past. Thanks for showing up today. There's like a million things happening in New York as always, and you all chose to come here. So we have a lot of amazing things to discuss with these folks, and then we'll open it up at the end for questions from you all. So if there are things that individual questions you have for some of them, or just general questions about the future of queer media and queer publishing, we'd love to hear them. So to kick things off, I'm just going to ask everyone to introduce yourselves to make sure that you can share some of the things that you're working on that you're excited about. Just tell us your name, a little bit about the projects you've been working on, and pronouns if you care to share, and maybe just something you're doing right now that's got you really excited. So I think, do we have 2 mics? So yeah, maybe we can start here and just go down here.
Hello, hi everyone. This is such a beautiful room. My name is Sarah Burke. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the editor-in-chief of Them. I've been a journalist for a long time. Before that, I was doing special projects at Vice, and I was an art critic, making zines in Oakland and that sort of thing. So I'm really excited to be here.
Hey everybody, I'm Kamikaze Jones. I'm the current arts editor of WUSSY Magazine. I started as a field correspondent for WUSSY, which is a title I gave myself. I worked my way up through the traditional routes. I'm also a performance artist, sound artist, and curator. So happy to be here.
Hey, I'm Tyler Akers. I'm the arts editor at Gay Letter Magazine. Been there since like 2016, 2017. Yeah, I'm a painter myself, so I'm most interested in painting, mostly write about painting, and helping sort of curate the arts sections in the magazine. Yeah.
I'm Michael Street. I'm a freelance writer and editor. I've written for them actually, and a few other people. And yeah.
A lot of other people.
My name is Whitney Mallett. I'm the founding editor of the Whitney Review of New Writing, which is a print-only biannual publication that is really devoted to books. A lot of the books in our collaborators are, here on display. We have a feature interview with Mackenzie Wark in the past issue. Slava McGotten interviewed someone. The Chandelier book, it's great to see Brontez Burnell we had. Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of, intersection in the things that choosing to cover with like a conversation around literature.
You hold on to that one with you got it. I got this one. We'll just send them back and forth. Thank you all, and thank you all so much for being here. I think it's a precarious time in media, as it is in so many industries. I think that has created a lot of opportunities to have great conversations about what solutions there are, and I think that queer media especially being so often on the outskirts of mainstream publishing, can offer really real solutions. So I think to kick things off, I do just want to start off with the hellscape that is modern media. Just acknowledging that it's been a rough year for journalism. We've seen a lot of layoffs, even just in 2024 alone. Obviously, Pitchfork being sort of absorbed / shuttered, huge layoffs at LA Times, kind of you name it. People are shedding really quality journalists left and right, often in spaces that need them most. Often new initiatives that are about giving voice to marginalized people are so often the first ones to go. So it is a little bit of a hellscape. That said, I think we're also seeing some interesting solutions or responses to that. So the first thing I want to hear about, and these questions are all collective, so feel free to jump in, and then I'm happy to ask some more guided ones if we're feeling shy. But I'd love to hear, this doesn't strike me as a very shy group, so I'd love to hear from you all how, Sarah's shy, no questions for Sarah. Sarah, question for you. How, just sort of on a personal note, in your own circle of friends and colleagues in the industries that you're around, how has that precarity affected the people around you, maybe you yourself? And maybe what are some responses that you're seeing that have you thinking, have you feeling hopeful, just have you thinking about what things might look like as we watch mainstream media sort of collapse and slowly fall apart?
And I've been interested in just finding kind of almost like patrons, like who are the people who has money and like cares about good criticism or good media or good journalism. And I think the visual art world, you know, the fashion world, these are maybe, I mean, it's like almost like I feel like it's like the feudal system or something. Like, who cares about this conversation or feels invested in it but has some extra money?
I mean, I'm a freelancer, so, and a lot of my friends are freelancers. And so we have a very pessimistic view of it, because it's sort of like, you know, I've written for a few people and you see like all of your editors that you normally would work with are no longer there, or you wonder if they have the budget to commission you again. And increasingly, I feel like, and this is a side tangent, but I feel like also there's just like more people who want to write. But in addition to all of that, I think that like a lot of the conversations we've been having are, is it time for a pivot? And these are some people that I know who actually have jobs now, who are like high up in the masthead at different publications, and they're like, oh, do I need to be getting out of journalism? So it's quite sad and disappointing, I think. And I didn't want to say that because it was like very dark, but yeah, that's like, those are the conversations that we're often having. And I think that even my friends that are inside are all having conversations about how much more of their jobs are less journalism, whether or not they're an editor. Because I think it was, you know, editors have always had like a portion of their position being the business. But I think increasingly more and more of the people who were lower and lower on the masthead that you would anticipate would be staff writers are doing more and more work that's like not journalism. And so it's, yeah, those are the conversations that my friends and I have been.
Gosh, it's a big question. I feel like there's a lot of ways to answer it. Media, I think in general, we're going through this like massive change where these more like corporate large entities are going through like an existential sort of crisis, which is sort of more interesting, right, for the readers, I think, where we have, you know, podcasts and like Substack and these ways of sort of like multi-source medias. And then, I mean, in terms of finance, which is always the thing I think that is like catching our crawl. I mean, we depend mostly on the fashion world, which is limiting, right? Because while I don't want to like bite the hand that feeds me, I've always kind of felt like the fashion world somehow tricked young people into buying like designer bags and shoes instead of magazines and books and art and you know, going to films. So I don't really again, at risk of biting the hand, you know.
That's why we're sponsored by Poland Springs. And
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We depend on that, but then also, we're a pretty small editorial team, you know, maybe like 5 people put together Gay Letter in total. They put their hands on the entire magazine. You know, Whitney's actually part of our editorial team too. But you know, we depend on a lot of freelance independent writers. And yeah, like word on the street is it's really tough right now. Just because even these, you know, large fashion world entities are holding the coin purse pretty closely. Yeah, so I don't know if that
Yeah, I can speak to this. I mean, to Whitney's point, I always imagine there'll be some sort of like resurgence of like patronage or like this idea that there'll be like an anonymous owner of a chateau who will like, commission smut.
a dream.
Yeah, you know, and like that's something that's held dear to my heart for a long time. But also for full transparency, I'm like, you know, an MFA student and like, you know, art editor and also like bartending on the weekends at a beer bar, you know, so it's thinking of this porosity of like, you know, the gig economy, and to your point, like everyone I talk to is like trying to get out of whatever business they're most accustomed to, you know, like everyone's trying to flee the nonprofit world and return to service work or flee the service industry and, you know, become a scrappy, faggy newspaper man. So yeah, there's just a lot of like omnidirectional noise that is interesting to explore. And yearning, which I think is kind of part of like this ethos of like, you know, DIY organization and mobilization around publishing in its many forms.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit kind of on the other side of the coin of things. Them is owned by Condé Nast, which owns Pitchfork, and those who might have been following the layoffs know that Condé went through a lot of layoffs late last year. So yeah, I mean, it sucks. It's really awful. I think what keeps me going, I mean, I'm lucky that our brand is already so small that we didn't really get hit. And we just really try to focus on doing our work and kind of having fun with each other, and like our tiny little gaggle. But I think in terms of like what keeps me hopeful about media in general is genuinely like work from like WUSSY and, you know, seeing like Gay Letter. And I recently like was judging like a magazine award, which I'm not qualified to do, so but for some reason, and I was judging a category of like small print magazines from across the country, and I was like, wow, there's so many actually still great small print magazines about like trees, like geckos, like there's so many like highways, like I'm glad that people are still pouring their passions into these like tiny print publications kind of thing. But I think for me, you know, I came into my role as a journalist and then quickly realized that like I needed like an MBA. Like Condé doesn't have publishers, so like the EICs are running the newsroom and also running the business side. And so I've learned so much about monetization in the past 2 years, unfortunately. And there's just so many KPIs, and like the reality is that like people are just not reading in the same ways, right? And so it sucks because you have to kind of like shift your focuses, and there's a lot of like, you know, pivot to video, as you might have heard. But I'm trying to stay like excited about also the potential of that. So we've started like acquiring queer short films, and like we're gonna try to launch like a film festival and put those on social, and still trying to like do fun things amidst all of the, you know, the hellscape.
The hellscape, yeah. Yeah.
You did say something that I did want to bring up, and maybe this is a good thing, maybe it's not. You were talking about sort of like this, like one sponsor or patron. And you know, Bud Magazine, right, like is underwritten by Bottega. I think. And so there are those cases where that happens. But as someone who worked at Maxim Magazine as well as at Al, the issue that happens with those kinds of things is it like it can be great, it's great while it's great. And then when it's sort of the all your eggs in one basket, like when that one person is like, I don't like that cover, or like, I don't think you're going the right direction. I also worked at Man of the World. All three of those magazines went through that. Yeah, it just, you know, I remember Man of the World was my first job, and you know, we had a great creative director, we had a great fashion director, all that stuff. And the owner one day was like, I don't like the direction, and everyone was fired the next day. So, and he could do that because he was bankrolling the company. And so, you know, same at Maxim, Big Laurie, who was the owner, disagreed with Kate Lamphere, who was like him and number, an iconic editor. And for one, he wanted to have his signature on the cover. Of every cover, he wanted his signature under the word Maxim. And she said, no. And he said, you're fired. You know what I mean? So like, that's like it, you know, on one right hand, I'm like, oh, that'd be great to have that. But it's like, it is a lot of power that is dependent upon this person's feeling that literally that day sometimes. So, sorry.
I also think one of the solutions more broadly is universal basic income.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you can't talk about the landscape of media without thinking about the wider society that we live in. And I think the collapse of mainstream media is really intricately intertwined into a society that is failing institutionally in a lot of really important ways. So I think that that is important. I think that this question of, you know, how you stay afloat, balancing editorial independence with just financially staying alive, I think is a big question. It's obviously something that we deal with at WUSSY every day. We're so lucky to have the freedom to do whatever we want. We can get as filthy, as smutty as we want, and we know Kamikaze's gonna go there. And we're so grateful for it. And there's no overlord saying, this makes me uncomfortable and we're not gonna run it. On the other hand, we would love to pay our contributors a hell of a lot more than we do. So I think, because I feel like this is a crowd that would be grateful for the conversation, I would love to hear a little bit more about how you approach the balance of institutional support and editorial freedom. I think one of the things that we really loved about assembling this particular panel is we have a real range of outlets that are supported institutionally. Obviously, Condé Nast, you know, like big legacy media. And I'm curious, Sarah, I know you're shy, but we'd love to hear some of what that looks like. I love them. I think you all are doing really amazing work, and how you balance the, you know, having people who have opinions, who have powerful opinions about what you can and cannot say, versus maybe the Whitney Review where you're having to, you know, you get to run your own show. How does that work? So I'd love to hear it. You don't have to get into the full nitty gritty of how you keep your outlets afloat, but where's that balance? And maybe what does the thing that you've landed on, what freedoms has that allowed you? And maybe what are some of those challenges? I think we'd love as WUSSY to hear more from you all about that. So I'd love to hear that. Maybe Sarah, we start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I get this question kind of a lot because my boss, there's a movie about her being really mean. Oh, the Devil Wears Prada. So I think, yeah, there's like, you know, a lot of lore there. But the reality as far as like the limitations and challenges that we face is actually much more around meeting KPIs, you know, hitting traffic metrics, selling enough ads, like those kinds of things. Like Condé is good about editorial independence, and I've never had anyone tell me, you know, you've gone too far or anything like that editorially. And that's really great. You know, obviously there are certain times when you need sign off, like when you do a cover and she has to look at it and say, looks good or hate that.
Anna does.
Yes, yeah, she
Wow.
approves all, she's the global creative director, so she approves every cover that goes out in any Hyundai magazine. But mostly it's like about traffic, right? Like we have to meet these high standards of traffic goals, and the reality is that what people read online and actually click through to, and what we sense that people want to see is actually not aligned. So we know that our audience cares about LGBTQ plus rights, all of these fights, these legislative attacks. And that's what we want to cover, we care about pop culture too, but the reality is that people don't actually read those stories. For the most part, people really love to read stories about celebrity news.
Yeah.
And so we're kind of obligated to do that work and kind of balance all of these things. So yeah, it's really more about just like hitting those metrics for us.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I'm building something that's kind of in a way an opposite, but it's also still working on an advertiser model. So in some ways it's similar. And I've come from a background where I've been on the board of directors of 2 nonprofit publications in the past, and it was not a model that I wanted to use this time. I think that, not to go into like the whole thing about all the reasons why, but I do think that the advertising model has possibility, but I also think with this metrics thing, having worked at other, publications where Amanda is asking like, but how many clicks did this online ad get? I think print media gives you a little bit of freedom with that because they see it as like a chic art object that they're a part of, which they don't have as many requirements, or like they don't ask for as much performance, which is like an interesting thing versus online. I also think that what happened with online ads when media transitioned into being online, I think that I still think you can actually get higher rates for print than you can get for online, because they gave like a ground floor rate when online was new and it was like secondary. And I think like the deal was kind of bad now that it's our dominant media, and it kind of sucks. But so I think that online advertising is really its own beast, and print advertising has different possibilities. One of my colleagues, or I think my associate publisher, I don't know, some of you might know Michael Bullock. He's working on this review with me, and he was the American publisher of Buck for 10 years prior to the relaunch of Bottega. But he has a lot of experience with doing something that was really transgressive, but finding people in the fashion world that were allies. Because there are a lot of people at these big companies who have power who really care. Like, I think there was a story, I went to a panel about Buck where they were like all the corporate people at one of the advertisers were like always trying to get them to cancel doing Buck, but it was like Tom Ford himself who was like, no, I believe in this. So like, it's like, there are people that are allies. And I guess it's like really trying to build those bridges.
I'm trying to figure out what I want to say. So I think like I'm a freelancer now, but I was previously editorial director for Out and The Advocate and working across print and digital. And I came in under Philip's team. So, so I wanted to say 2 things. One thing is to what Sarah was saying, which is that retweets don't equal clicks. And I think that I learned that very quickly while I was there. I've always been like a data analytics person. And so, this is a very, crass or whatever, but for example, when a trans woman dies, that will get you so many retweets and so many quote tweets and all of that. But the clicks are not always there unless you happen to be the first one. And then people are clicking because other people need to write the story and they need to get the information from you. But that's just the reality of it. So it's really interesting to me online when you go online and you see people being like, why do you always write these stupid stories? It's because those are the stories people are clicking. That's why you have so many stories about Drag Race, because Drag Race is unknown, you will get traffic. You don't have to tweet it. You don't have to post it. It will traffic. And so the stuff that people say that they want to hear, they don't. I hate to say it's performative, but it always feels super performative because people want you to kind of signal that these are our values. But that doesn't, and they want to signal to people that that's their values, so they retweet it, but they don't read it. So it's like this really specific like game that you have to play. But like actually more to the actual question, I think around sort of how you balance kind of the expectation of overlords and money and all that sort of stuff. So I think that like when I came in to what was then Pride Media, like, you know, I came in with Philip, we were a very headstrong team. And so we did not mind going head to head with our owner about various issues. And this like came to a head at one point. And so it ended up being kind of this thing around one, choosing your battles. Certain things were worth fighting over, certain things were not. And then figuring out like, well, not figuring out, but like I think realizing that it is a business. And so if we, like we did want to run a story about chastity that I wrote, and we want to have a photo of a guy in chastity with no pants on, you know, we have to think about like, oh, is Lucas Honda gonna decide, actually, this is not the magazine for us, and like, we don't want to advertise, and now we've lost a six-figure deal because we wanted to run this one story, and not even the story is the issue, right? The image is the issue, and so it's about those questions, and it's a weird thing, particularly within queer gay media, because there are things that, for example, a details could have gotten away with, that a GQ can get away with, that they don't allow us to get away with. Because there's like this idea of the gays, and not GAZ. There's this idea of, you know, we've done it, it's like, there's an eroticism that is not present in the GQ edition. It's like, oh girl, it's still there.
Yeah.
Like, it's the same stylist, actually. But yeah, so I think like it's a lot about discernment, and it's about picking your battles and which one is worth fighting and which one's not. And then, you know, once I eventually worked my way up to being editorial director, I had sort of had enough arguments that I didn't have to have them anymore. That the people above me trusted that like I had enough discernment that like if the traffic was correct, then like I got no qualms from them. So yeah, that's where, but it took, I think it took having the predecessors of Philip and a few others, and having those fights until they realize, oh, this person actually does have good discernment and like knows where the line is, and also understands that this is a business and is not going to risk the business to publish a story that like in the long run isn't worth it.
Yeah.
So I think that answers.
Yeah.
Gosh, yeah, I guess to sort of rewind a little bit, Gay Letter sort of started as like a listserv, in like, you know, like the 2010s moment. It was not a magazine, it was an email that sort of went out to whoever would subscribe, and it had like for every day of the week an event. So like over time, people started to like pick up on that thread and started attending, and it sort of built this like community of people who were all kind of going to the Gay Letter or whatever we were curating that week. And then, you know, turned into a magazine a few years later. Like I said, it is a pretty small team. I am mostly interested in like painting, and sort of we've been writing this like figurative movement for a few years now. So I think they, you know, kind of trust me with curating that side of things. But then, you know, Abby Benitez and Tom Jackson, who sort of founded the magazine. Abby is like a nighttime photographer, and so you know, like nightlife, and I think that informs a lot of like the curatorial choices. He's kind of like watching, you know, who is rising up in that like subculture underground, and then Tom Jackson, you know, is like comes from like more of a advertising background, and is super interested in like the phenomenon of queer fame, right, and like how that has sort of morphed and changed over the years. So I think we all kind of come at it from a different point of view. I mean, I think similarly to like the sort of Tom Ford thing, we do have these like really generous benefactors who have kind of kept us afloat. Like Mark Jacobs has been like very instrumental in like keeping gay letter in the black. And you know, and also like Jonathan Anderson, of Jonathan Anderson and Lueve has been like really supportive. I think in terms of the like choices we make, and like when we have to like censor ourselves or second guess, you know, I think the cover that we just did is like sponsored by Balenciaga. It's Amanda Lepore, and is sponsored by Balenciaga. So that is a bit of like a negotiation with some PR people, right? What that cover is going to look like. But then there are other covers, like we did a topless Honey Dijon cover, and we knew that there were a lot of places where that just cannot be put on the shelf facing outward. Like you have to cover that up. But we just knew it would like, you know, gag the fat, so we did it. And yeah, I don't know if that really answers the question.
Yeah, definitely. How has it gone?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it from a couple different directions because historically WUSSY's, you know, financial resources for the magazine comes from like event sales and like, you know, like a community organization. So I often think of like, you know, the magazine itself as like an art object or like, you know, like an activated kind of like piece. That being said, I think we all wear like a lot of hats and we also kind of have like a small tight-knit crew, and that can lead to some really interesting things in terms of like the one for me, one for them kind of like push and pull of things. We were trying to like, you know, like explore new sponsorships this year and kind of like, you know, like looking at marketing opportunities, and it led to some interesting altercations with CEOs of you know, men's lingerie organizations, and yeah, just navigating that, but also thinking about like community as the fulcrum for what we do. And Tyler, I was always interested in talking to you about this because you come from more of a visual arts scenario, and most of my primary interests are, if not porn studies, like radical queer performance legacies. So like seeing how that shapes the publication, how that acts as a container for the publication, and how that feeds into the legacy of WUSSY being a place that kind of curates or promotes or commissions like queer performance.
Yeah, definitely. I do. I think the WUSSY model is interesting in that a lot of events have helped fund the work that we're doing. But I think that that also has helped us build a community around that. And I think that that's a really big part when we talk about queer media, is talking about the communities that it activates, the communities that it invites, and also become supported by, you know. I think that that can be a part of the model. I think that the dream of the rich chateau daddy who will buy your magazine and pay all of your bills. Yeah, I'll take a mommy daddy. But then you bump into some of these questions about editorial control. And I think that community is it's something that we think about with WUSSY a lot. And I think is something that is really important to remember, that these are spaces that are really about building community, and that those communities want to keep these places alive. And so I think things like fundraisers, Patreons, monthly subscriptions, Substacks, I think is also something that we've thought about and I think are an interesting part of this. I want to circle back to digital stuff, but first I want to talk about sex. I want to talk about smut. I think that that's the thing we think about and talk about at WUSSY a lot. We love a little bit of filth. We love playing with that. But I also think that's a big, proud tradition of queer media going way, way back, when what queer media was just subversively finding other queer people who were invisible through writing and art that was about sex and about desire and about connecting in that way. And I think that that's a really proud tradition, and I think speaks to some of these issues of talking about putting bodies on covers and what that looks like and who gets to say. A lot of that Poland spring. Yeah. We just need cup holders next to these. Yeah, so I think that I don't really have a specific question. I'm just curious if you all think about the way that you talk or write or publish about queer sexuality, and what parts of that feel really central to the work that we're all doing here, and how we protect that in a time where queerness is way more visible in ways that are amazing, but can also feel extractive and exploitative of sort of polishing it up and making it palatable to a wider audience. And I think one of the things that we love about WUSSY is that we're not about polishing it for a mainstream audience. Like, this magazine would freak out a lot of old Southern people. And it does routinely. I cover the state legislature in my real job, and I'm just waiting for the moment when some Southern legislators are like, look at this stuff that they're publishing down here.
Especially if they read the Empress Wu piece.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm gonna just ship that to all of the Republicans in the state legislature. Yeah, the value of that, it runs really deep, and I'm just curious to hear how that manifests in some of the work you do, or how you think about it. All the way down, yeah. We're sharing really well, guys. Good job.
Our debut issue definitely, it doesn't feature but a lot of writing and interviews. Like, I mean, we have Brontes Purnell talking about who gave him Hog. I don't know if anyone has ever read Samuel Delaney's Hog. It's probably like the filthiest, most book I've ever read personally. And he's like, oh, there's this like bisexual daddy who like had his like 300-pound wife upstairs, and he would get me to fist him on his weight bench. And one day after, he was just like, here, you should read Hog, you know? So like, then we have an interview with Delaney. So like, there was definitely a lot of eroticism conversation in that first issue. I think that maybe a benefit of what I'm doing is there's no images. Like, I'm doing a text-only magazine, which I think that's an interesting tradition too of smut, where it kind of can go under the radar more because it's like, who actually reads words? Like, you know.
I'm gonna say two relatively short things, I think, which the first one is like, the reality is that like, so many publications, a large percentage of their traffic comes from like random sex stuff. The most random sex stuff. One publication that I was an editor for, I'll use that, was there was 1 month, no promotion, old slideshow, brought in 73% of traffic. So like, that's like, and editors know it, like, you have to do it the right way, so like advertisers don't get mad, but they like, that's where the traffic is. So like that's just one thing, and it's very common with queer publications specifically. It's why almost all of them have like very basic 101 like how to give a blowjob. The story that I was talking about before was a how to give a blowjob story, and I like, anyways, I'm not gonna go into that, but so that's just like number one. It's the value of it is like, it's a lot. And number two, I think like for me, like when I went into Out, actually, before I took my job there, I had a very frank conversation with Philip about the things that I wanted to cover, and so I said that I wanted to cover sort of the ballroom scene as news, just like we would cover any other thing, any other topic. And I wanted to cover, well, ballroom/drag, both as like news, just like if a pageant, like it doesn't have to be Drag Race, if a pageant winner wins something, like I can cover it as news. And if I can't do that, I don't want the job. And then the second thing was leather sex fetish. And so like, he was completely on board. There was no like back and forth. He was like what? And so, but the reason that I wanted to do that specifically around sex is because, as we all know, like sex education in this country is non-existent, and even less so when it comes to anything outside of like procreative heterosexual sex, cisgender heterosexual sex. So, for me, obviously, it's like this, you know, this is a traffic thing, but it's also like people need this education, and so the further, even outside of, I wanted to be able to write about it outside of just, you know, regular gay sex. I wanted to include fetishes because I think that there's even less education, there's less information about like, how do you engage in fisting in a way that is healthy and like, that you know what you need to know and you know when you need to stop. And so, yeah, so for me, it's really important because it is a service that we are doing for people, to write about chastity as it became really, really, well, right before it became super, super popular. Was like really interesting to me, and I see those stories. I think I did 3 stories, and I've been shared sort of a lot. I see them often, so.
Smut, yes. So I guess you have to rewind again to like the moment of like those early bodybuilding magazines like Physique Pictorial and Bob Miser, and you know, they sort of paved the way for any of this being on your walls. Like he like literally went to the courts to be able to send this kind of stuff through the mail because they said, you know, this is illegal. So, you know, in some ways we're like indebted to this, what was perceived as like straight culture smut, but then, you know, has been another more or less reclaimed. And then, yeah, and then the conversation of reclamation, right? Where like maybe in the art world right now you have an artist like something like Tom of Finland, which is considered sort of the height of a smut and is like very like in vogue. But if you start to really examine it, I think that you see that he's using a lot of like, you know, cop and fireman like uniforms and things that he like intends on maybe subverting, but then maybe the question becomes like, can you really use the tools of the master to dismantle the master's house? And you know, also the question of visibility, like different body types, I think is also a question when you start to really examine Tom of Finland. But then, you know, Tom of Finland house has been really great in creating like a residency for all these amazing smut artists. So like in turn, kind of maybe atoning for some of the works, you know, maybe more conservative qualities.
My answer is basic. Michael said it perfectly. Like that's essentially the situation we're in. Like one of our top stories every month is how to do for the water bottle. A real good classic. Don't throw that away. But yeah, I totally agree. Like I really think beyond it being really good for traffic, it really is a service. Like when I came in, what part of the relaunch that I did was launching a new section of the site devoted just to these kinds of guides, not just about sex, but also about like harm reduction and other kinds of explainers that you search for on Google type thing. Because they really don't exist like in a expert informed way. Like, you know, I think we're so used to having to like go to Reddit and stuff to know what the best, you know, top surgery aftercare is and things like that. So it's also fulfilling to actually create those guides and have them be doctor informed and things like that. So that's kind of the main, it's not smart. It's not as sexy, but that's kind of the main way we engage with sex.
And it's interesting to hear more of like the pedagogical aspect of it, because for me as like an editor and like, you know, a lot of what, you know, drives my work kind of like as an artist across all disciplines is kind of like the inherent politicization of queer smut and like kind of how it, you know, rallies against homo respectability. And I'm guessing that I curated or facilitated a conversation between two conceptual artists and dominatrixes named Empress Wu and Cleo Yang for the latest issue. And I'm guessing it was the most raunchy thing we've ever had in the magazine, because they describe kind of like this like fantastic architectural enema work that they do. And it's really captivating. They're also both members of Red Canary Song, which is a great mutual aid organization. So I think shocking people out of their complacency is always really great, and to have the autonomy to do that is, you know, part of what I love about WUSSY, like, and being able to kind of have challenging conversations and like what is like an ethical transgressive ideology that could happen and how can it be used for further mobilization is always, you know, what gets me going.
Yes, definitely. Our editorial meetings are my favorite, where Kamikaze explains to me what it's gonna look like, and I'm like, amazing, that sounds great. Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think that we need both, you know, like I think that service journalism, I was on Autostraddle when I was 23, like trying to figure out like what lesbian sex was, because porn was not that helpful. Have you all not seen lesbian porn? it's not that helpful as a primer, but it has its advantages. But that kind of service journalism, I think can be very helpful. And as some of this maybe smuttier, filthier stuff that we're able to do in these spaces, maybe in print media where you're not necessarily, I think all of that is really useful. I think, Tyler, you kind of started us off here, and I want to come back to this reclamation or just troubling the traditional idea of what queer media used to be, which I think was very much media for gay, white, cis men. And I think that that's something that we are all really engaged in trying to tangle with, wrestle with, always being in conversation with. And so I definitely want to make sure we just have a chance to talk about that. What are the ways that those issues are still here? I think when we talk about big funding, we're still working within an institution that still mainstreams those voices. So I think that that's still something that we're trying to get outside of. But I'm also curious in terms of just what troubling that narrative. I'm thinking about, Michael, your work recreating out covers that maybe looked one way in the 90s and then sort of doing something new there, I think is really interesting. And I think when we think about who we're putting on our covers, that's something we're talking about. So, but also just who we're talking to and the stories that we're telling. So I think, how is your work or the work that you're seeing in conversation with some of that traditional narrative? And also thinking maybe about beyond New York, we're a Southern publication. So we kind of have this Southern lens. It's not all we cover, but we're always thinking about it. So just thinking beyond maybe those traditional realms and going beyond that.
So I think that to answer the question like really flatly, I don't necessarily see my work in conversation. I'm not thinking about the quote unquote canon, because I just don't know that it is. I think about the canon in so much as I understand that my work informs how history will be remembered. Like that's why I got into journalism, is because I felt like, oh, there are perspectives or things that are happening that are not being recorded in stories. And so like, they're not going to be recorded in history. Because most historians form a lot of their work from news reports. So like, that's why I really, to be frank, like got into it. And so that's kind of really the only way that I think about my work in relationship to canon. I don't really think about like what was left out or not left out, because I also think that like it's often said that these things were left out, but they necessarily weren't really. There were like the things that people remember is what, like we have selective memory. And as a journalist, I think about this a lot, right? Like our impression of the past is not necessarily like accurate to what happened. And so like, for example, everyone sort of goes into this like, Out was versus gay men, blah, blah, blah. When Out was founded, there was a gay male editor-in-chief, and there was a lesbian female editor-in-chief, right? Like they were very intentional about wanting it to be for both. And that changed, which often happens actually. It changed because of the money. It changed because they realized that like it was very difficult to sell a magazine when there wasn't a specific target audience that was one group as a consumer, right? Like gay men and lesbian women, like it's not necessarily the same consumer, And so once they could say that this is a gay man making this much a month and in this age range, then advertisers could very quickly like, oh, I want to be in that book, right? And so that's what happened. And there was a story a few years ago, actually, in Adweek, I think it was the woman who started one of the weeks about lesbians. But she was talking about this issue as well around, I don't remember. But she was talking about this issue as well as the issue of trying to get advertising for lesbian media and the fact that advertisers would look at the publication and be like, we don't need to advertise to lesbians, we're advertising in women's magazines. So like, we don't need to advertise just for them. Or like, if it's about them being gay, well, we advertise an Out. So like, we don't need to like specifically advertise to specifically lesbians. So I think that like we can have the conversation. I think that we look at magazines as culture and like all this other stuff and representation, but I also think that we have to contend with the fact that it's a business. And that some of the decisions that are made are not indicative of like a politic, but they're indicative of like, if we intend to keep this going, this is how this has to work. And so, you know, I say all that to say, like, when we came back to, when Philip's team came back to Out, I'm trying to figure out what I can say and what I can't, but like, we did this issue, that was the women's and non-binary femmes issue, right? And so like, I think this is a good example to use because in that issue, there were only women and non-binary femmes in every image of that issue, every image that we made. Every writer, every editor, no, not the editors, every writer, every stylist, every photographer were women and non-binary femmes. But the reality is Out's print audience is, at the time, I'm not gonna say what it is now, but at the time was 90% male. So, so the ads were for men's. And so it was like, it just like, it doesn't really make sense for the business. And so you continue to do this thing of kind of like, oh, you know, this thing that's meant to be political or meant to be representative of an entire community, that's not actually the community that's like actually picking up the book. And so it does beg the question of like, who are you serving, right? Are you serving the consumer that has subscription to you, particularly in a time where like people aren't going out to get these subscriptions, right? And so we were seeing this uptick of traffic and this uptick of followers on social, but that was not corresponding with an uptick of subscriptions because people weren't subscribing, they were just following. And then, but what we were seeing was like unsubscribers because like they were like, this isn't the book that I signed up for. I signed up for a book about gay men. And so I think it's like really important whenever you have a conversation about like who's appearing in the magazine, who's appearing on the cover of the magazine, be very realistic about like, this is not just like this thing, this dream, like this is a business. That there are this many people who work here, whose jobs depend on it, there's a budget that needs to be made, and like, how do we get to that number? And so, that was a lot, but.
I guess the one way, I mean, I have like a very small platform, but I do try to platform, like, for example, like, you know, there was like a smutty poetry book with images that was self-published by this, like porn personality sex worker Rachel Oyster Kim, and it's like I just want to put that book like in conversation with something that's like published by Penguin Random House, you know. It's like, you know, I have this, it's like a small conversation I'm making, but like I just make intentional choices of just putting printed matter that I care about, and that's not always like in a diversity of like identity way, but sometimes it is, but sometimes it's like, you know, yeah, self-published writing. Another example of Johanna Fadiman, she, you know, from La Tigra, also writer of New Yorker. I mean, she has this incredible zine series, Artomania, that had kind of like an anniversary issue, covered that. So I just like, yeah, I guess self-published writing, you know, platforming it, not like saying like, oh, it's like you published it yourself, you can't like cover it in a serious way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it becomes a question of like the mix of like, for lack of a better term, like a high and low kind of thing. You know, those are like fairly, you know, not useful words, but or categorizations, but yeah, I mean, I think on some level we kind of just acknowledge that we're always failing and that we need to like just fail as less as possible. Just because as soon as we materialize something that is like, you know, only able to feature so many people, there are people that are not being featured. So I think because we are sort of like a product of the like New York like nightlife art world, like these coteries of like, you know, queers in New York, I think that they hold us accountable to some degree. Like as much as we hate the like troll, we also appreciate constructive criticism. So you know, I think Gay Letter has shifted and changed a lot over the years, and I think our readers have held us accountable to that. And it's a better magazine for it.
Yeah, I'm glad I let my phone go first because once again, perfectly said. Thank you. But yeah, I think we don't, from the outside, I think obviously we're all part of this, all these queer publications, we're all part of this little club, but I think we do see ourselves as pretty part of a different kind of lineage than like the Pride Media publications, like Out and Advocate. And I wasn't there when Phil founded them. But you know, I think arguably it was founded even as like an antidote, right? As a response to the exclusivity of those publications and the idea of having something that doesn't need to kind of course correct and doesn't have all this baggage of having decades and decades of being kind of exclusive, but can from the very foundation be really inclusive, you know, sapphic people, of non-binary trans people. And yeah, I mean, I think similarly, like we just don't actually think about it that much. Like I think our team is very sapphic forward. And I just mean like, if you talk about like the balance of like people's orientations, we have like a heavily kind of sapphic team, and that's just coincidental. But that just shows up in our work, you know, and the majority of our editor staff is trans, and that shows up in our work. And so really we're just kind of focused on like, what are the conversations we're having with each other, and trying to not think too much about the canon again and stuff like that. Yeah.
I think I'm like thinking about stickiness and messiness and wetness. Like I love like a wet magazine. And what I mean by that is like something that has porosity and like, you know, this idea of mixing the high and the low, I think is really important to WUSSY in terms of like a platform for valid criticism, but also just like cunty gossip and like, you know, stuff like that. Those should be in conversation with each other, and like there's a contrapuntal energy there that can be really fascinating and generative, and also engender new types of community and kind of be, you know, create new subjectivities. And like I think that's what's really exciting about the kind of autonomy that we have. And then in dialogue with the canon, whether or not it actually is, I mean, I think there's like a rich history of like, you know, avoiding kind of like archival like rich white male elitism, and like, you know, kind of like evincing that and like kind of, you know, interrogating that and figuring out how to, you know, how those infrastructures are still in place from like the history of like gay publishing and how to support them.
Yeah.
I just want to say, like, what I was trying to say, one of the things I was trying to say before that I got off from, was just that I think there is a history of gay media being extremely expansive. And that covers the entire community. And I think that like, it's not as known or it's not as remembered, but there is a history. Like if you look, like, I don't think that you could talk about zine culture without talking about like small queer presses. And those presses were like often serve super specific niches within our community. And so that's what I meant to sort of like make sure that I sort of underscored, is the like, that's why I don't really, you know, it's just, I don't know. Yeah, I just wanted to say that. Like, I think it's just super important that the history of gay media is actually more expansive than it is today, to be frank, like more expansive than the landscape is today. And when you really like dive in, it's kind of sad. It's something that I've been going through over the past 3 years. When you really dive into like our history, not just media, but all types of queer history, you are awakened to like things that we all think that we're doing that's new. And it's like, they've been doing this shit for 70 years. Like, we're not new. And so I think that that's one of the things that I'm always trying to keep in mind, is that like, just because you've been told that this was how it was, it's not necessarily reflective of like actually what was happening, right? And yeah, like even like I'm talking about the ballroom scene, you know, I went in to Out with this idea, like I'm gonna do it this way because like I don't think the ballroom scene was really covered. And it's like the ballroom scene had its own publications, like, you know what I mean? So it's just like, that's what I'm always trying to be super cognizant of, is just like most of us are not doing anything new, and if you dig deep enough, like, you'll find it. So
Yeah, I think what you said about memory, I think is so important, that the memory tends to become institutionalized because those are the things that are most visible and available. But if you dig a little deeper, there's so much more that, you know, the DIY zine making, there was a zine for every kind of subculture in the world, but it can be hard to access those. And I think that spaces like this that are giving us places to acknowledge that, to find that, I think is really important. And yeah, I think we're sharing that exhibit with Queer Kentucky, who are not here today, but are friends of ours that we love. And I think another outlet like WUSSY that's based in a place that's outside of big coastal cities, and that our coverage and our editorial content reflects that, and in surprising ways, not even something we set out to do necessarily, just the pitches we get from people who have deeply singular experiences that are impacted by where they come from. And I think that that's a long tradition that's been happening for a long time. It's just a matter of knowing where it is. I have a zillion more questions, but we are running out of time and I want a chance to give it over to you all. I'd love to hear, yeah, like 3 or 4 questions. Yes, in the back, the fellow, yep, you're pointing to yourself. You got it. Oh yeah, okay. And we have to go, but Whitney, give it up for Whitney. Thank you so much, Whitney. Thanks for being here. We'll wrap up in about 5 to 10 more minutes, but yes, please.
Thank you for the panel. I'm curious for like the small magazines that are publishing, when you publish print, do you keep your archives and have you marketed them to different institutions as well as academia? Because I know that I've offered collections like that. In fact, for instance, vintage things from the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and I sell them for a lot of money. And so what are those things for, like, say, Harvard or Yale or Berkeley? They'd be interested, like, say, Archive of Thought magazine, and also the ancillary things, not even the original, so you can actually market it more than once, and it could be quite lucrative.
Yeah, that's great, amazing. I hope we're worth millions of dollars in the future. Yeah, I'm curious to hear from you all about sort of archival practices for the print work that you're doing.
I mean, very informally, like we keep, a few boxes of each issue and, most issues sell out. So we don't really have a big stockpile. But are very open. If you have any inquiries, like reach out. We would love to sell,
There's collectors that will sponsor that and have quite flush with funds to make sure those things are preserved, because you're a generation where they're not used to the internet, but these are older gentlemen, and so they don't have children. Set up foundations at these colleges. In fact, right now I'm trying to give away a collection and with money. And so that's where it should be.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the moment, I think a lot of magazines just sort of like are focused on the present. Like even like Linda Simpson, for instance, did Comrade magazine like throughout the 80s. At the time, she was saving very few copies and, just sold the archive off for like a sizable amount of money. So it's like, yeah, I mean, we have thought about it, but are not saving like, we honestly don't even really have much room to do that, right? Because we are working on a budget. So yeah, open to inquiries.
Yeah. Yeah, right here, right in front of the person. Yeah, that's you.
So circling back to what was mentioned earlier about your individuals who know looking to leave the media landscape, that I started an editorial in my early 20s in PR when the digital happened. And then recently I went into branding to follow that lens. But my question is, what kind of personal thread would you pull on creatively if you had to continue paying rent that would leave you leaving the space?
What would you all be doing if you weren't fucking around doing this?
Well, recently it's come to my attention that there's, ghostwriters for OnlyFans content. And that sounds really intriguing.
Great.
Thank you. I also think of like, fishmongering as like a valid modality. But yeah, I mean, typically, I'm like an interdisciplinary artist. So like a lot of those things, it's kind of questions that I'm constantly asking myself. It seems like copywriting is like something that people fall back on a lot once they have like a certain like, established bylines or stuff like that. So I mean, like that also sounds, somewhat sad depending on the situation, or like at least compromising. Because I know like really brilliant writers who are like secretly, writing copy for Pampers, like, and that doesn't show up in their CV. So I mean, but it should.
Yeah.
I don't really have a good answer for this because the things that I would want to be doing, I don't think are lucrative. Like, I don't think that I would make a real living. So I'm kind of yeah, I don't know, but I think, before I became an art critic in that zone, I always really wanted to be a curator. And before I got this job, I had actually planned to like move into documentary work and like long form audio and stuff, which is still kind of like media, but I think that, like many of, my peers who I thought would always be journalists who have now moved over to being in Hollywood, that is probably what I would try to do also.
Yeah, I'll just say, I think freelancing, we spoke about a little bit. I think in some ways, journalists know how to be resilient in scary times because so much of it ends up being a gig economy. And for folks who are aspiring journalists, who are working as journalists, there's a lot of custom media out there that needs good writers, that pays well. Beyond New York, I think I'm an editor in the South and we're always looking for more writers. So I think that it's always really good to look beyond the space that you're in and see, because there's a lot of writing that still needs to be done. It cannot be done by AI yet, and is really a good place to be in. So I think that's something to think about. Yeah, up way in the back over there.
Yes, two questions, two more. One question is a little more complicated, and the other one's very short and sweet. My first question is, one of you said that gay media or gay journalism, the history of gay journalism has been more expansive in the history than it is today. I think it was you who said that.
Yeah.
But I didn't understand what that meant. I was wondering, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I'm just saying that I think that like the options that we had before there were more options than there are today. That's all. And I mean, I guess like it depends on how you think about it. If you're like, oh, well, every TikToker is gay media to me, then I'm like, okay, well. Shit.
There's something I guess I want to say about that. I mean, I think attention spans are pretty short these days.
Yeah.
So, there is, and just, with the sort of like archival turn, I think that we're sort of drowning in media. So, there are fewer and more at the same time. It's like this oxymoronic sort of position that we're in. I mean, I think also like as sort of lush as the zine world was in the past, like my friend Stuart's here, and we were once watching this Elvis documentary from like the 1970s. And it was on Turner Classic Movies. It was one of these like sort of like chopped and edited, him on tour. And they come on afterwards with the Turner Classic Movies and sort of talk about it. And they said at the time, like 1.2 billion people watched it live. And so like the idea, and it was like the second most viewed thing after the like Rumble in the Jungle, which was like this boxing event. But like Stuart and I were like, what? That's completely crazy. And we, went further to sort of like research what the population was during that time. And it was like, around like 4 billion. So the idea that like a quarter of the world was tuning in for this like Elvis concert was like really bizarre. So it's like, I think also the channels have changed. Like there are just so many more channels now. And that has sort of exploded possibility.
I want to hear your second question after. Oh, yes, please, Sarah. And then please stick around and chat with us afterwards. So we'll be here. We're going to Julia's bar afterwards. So we want to get the next one after that. I think we have time for one question after Sarah's side.
Sorry, just really quickly I think we've been talking also about zines, but I think what Mike, if I'm understanding correctly, what Michael's referring to also is that like pre-internet, there were also just so many other forms of publications, like newsletters and journals were also abundant beyond even just zines. Like there were, the first kind of queer newsletter was like started in the 1920s. And then there was like, Lou Sullivan's FTM. And then there were all these newsletters like around the world that people used to like exchange information. And a lot of them were led by trans people and lesbians, because that's also where a lot of the need was. You would get them in these manila envelopes that were like totally blank sort of thing.
And we don't have bar racks anymore. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, at least in New York. I don't know if other places, but like
That's where I got my start.
Mhm.
It's like, what?
And it's sort of recent too, right? Like, I feel like even
Yeah.
10 years ago, they were like playing around. Yeah.
Speaking of that point really quickly, just like even like I did a John Waters-based project for WUSSY like last year, like kind of an oral history project about like, you know, his legacy. And I spent time at the Wesleyan Archives, and like the name of the film Desperate Living came from like a lesbian quarterly from Baltimore that he got in a huge fight with for like lifting that name. So like even stuff like that, you know. And in terms of like, I've been thinking a lot about like the neoliberalization of the archive and like what, you know, what stays, you know, in cultural memory and what doesn't, and like, you know, and also what is meant to not be seen and what is meant to, you know, be in the closet, so to speak. So.
But yeah, talk about the importance of the archives, like just hold on to your stuff and put it in places where people will be able to find it. It's so important. We have one last question, and yes, I'd love to ask you in the back there with the glasses.
Okay, so just to circle back to where I guess this started, I mean, we all stood again, but speaking about what seems like a crisis in the media landscape, but I also see this like as being a kind of huge moment of opportunity, and particularly thinking about the political moments that we're undergoing and the acknowledgement of the genocide. I just like wonder where you collectively situate yourselves among what's happening politically, and I'm thinking particularly about cultural boycotts of Israel and the fact that the Poetry Project, for example, as a space endorsed that boycott, and I think has been more alive, more lively, busier, and more vibrant than I've ever seen it in, say, 50 years. And I'm just wondering what this kind of particular conjuncture, political as well as cultural, sees to kind of present to.
Yeah, beautiful question.
I mean, it's an ongoing conversation. Certainly we don't want to be like, you know, extremely reactionary. I mean, I know that there's an urgency, but yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing conversation. The boycott is definitely something that we are considering. And I think like all publications should. You know, we don't receive any funding from the Israeli state and don't intend to. So yeah, that's kind of where we stand right now. And you know, it's like also, I mean, talking about just like inclusion, there are a lot of like, you know, queer Palestinian artists who are in very high demand right now. So like a lot of them are sort of getting to choose what avenues they take. And as you know, we intend on getting more and more of that into our magazine when, you know, the right moment presents itself.
No. It's been an ongoing conversation for us too, and it's also something interesting because we don't really feel like we've seen many queer DIY publications make a formal stance about it. So it's, I think, something we're really interested in exploring. We signed the queer Palestinian artists list. Like we've been kind of taking steps to, you know, be accountable and transparent about our goals and like where we stand on that. But the formal boycott is something that we're still interested in interrogating.
Yeah, I mean, we've been trying to cover it as closely as our capacity really allows, and I'm proud of the work that we've been able to do. Frankly, there's been a lot of kind of protests that we've covered that we haven't seen covered in any other publications at all, and any other queer publications, and that feels a little bit like disappointing, you know? So we're really trying to just like, do our best as journalists to like stay on top of, you know, the incredible organizing that our community is doing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Beautiful. No.
No, I just, like, I don't work at a magazine, so I don't like, there's not like a stance that like a publication that I'm working with can take. But it's, you know, it goes back to my point earlier around the business and like all these other things, right? It's like so at one of the companies that I used to work at, I mean, this was years ago, this was 5 or 6 years ago, like there was a policy to never cover anything with this because it was just like the feeling at the company was that like there was no way to cover it without pissing someone off.
Yes.
And so like, 'cause they were like, just the words that you're using doesn't matter if you're trying to cover it as straight as possible. You're not, it's not, well,
Yeah.
it's not gonna it's not gonna work. So like, that was a policy of the company. It was like, we don't cover it at all. And this was, like I said, this was like 5 or 6 years ago. So before all of this. And I found out that because at the time I was in charge and I was like, I see this thing happening. Write about that. And my writer was like, I've been here longer than you. We don't do that. So that's what happened. But recently, another publication that I freelanced for and kind of provide some advice for the person who's helping to shape their editorial content, they did some coverage. And I think like the conversation that I ended up having with them was around this conversation I was talking about before about the business. Like that publication ended up losing their, going back to the one big sponsor, like their biggest sponsor, as a direct result of coverage. And they ended up having to cancel their tentpole event of the year as a result of losing its sponsor. And so like it ends up being, like I was saying before, it's like, it's a business. And like, it is interesting to think about like the ways, because it's not like this, like that we have this conversation around like, oh, well, you know, this is the right thing to do, which is true. And like, this is like, people agree with us, but like going back to the point around like having, you know, these sponsors, it's like, it often doesn't matter whether the whole public agrees with you. If there's one person in the right position at your sponsor, like they can pull the plug singularly. And so everyone in the world could be, you know, for you. And like that one person could say, actually, no, we're suspending our buy. And that could mean layoffs. And so it's like a really, I don't know, as someone who was in that position, it is a very interesting thing to think about making this decision that I believe in politically, that is going to affect the literal welfare of like my staff.
Yeah.
Because if something like that were to happen, and then I had to lay off my, like, you know what I mean? Like I think that thinking about that context is important. The decision that you make is yours, but I think that that context is super important when you're having this conversation.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you spoke.
One more thing.
Yeah.
I think it should be said too, it's like, we're a small team, so we can kind of like do what we want to do and we're not afraid to piss anybody off. I think what has been happening with the sort of firing and blacklisting of writers who are writing about this is like grotesque and deplorable. And I hope that like united we stand, like we can move forward from this moment and realize that like these sort of insidious figures are the ones at the top who are like calling those shots rather than the writers themselves. And I think, yeah, this like sort of like 5-6 years ago moment, it was like all conversations would sort of end at the like, it's complicated sort of stance, which is like now like just like an untenable position. It's not complicated, it is assault. So yeah, I think we're in an unprecedented moment and like what we do matters.
Yeah, I do. I think it matters a lot. And I think that this is a space to interrogate complicated questions in good faith, with real intention of having conversations without muzzling people. I think that's just a very troubling thing we've seen in mainstream media. And I think that's a really powerful place for those of us who can, to whatever capacity we can, be spaces where conversation can happen, giving voices to people who don't necessarily get those. So I think that's really important. Thank you all for your beautiful questions. Thank you all for joining us. We're so happy to have you. But yeah, give it up to these amazing panel. Please keep chatting with us. The book fair is open. The books are for sale. Please, at your leisure. We'll also have WUSSY merch for sale. Please check this out. We'll move it to the front. And then join us later. We'll be going to Julius. And tonight, Bed-Stuy, come on everybody. Mel Forever is hosting. It's going to be a good time. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.
Real quick, I just want to say, if you're not already on our email list, you can sign up for that on our website or at the back of the room. And tomorrow we will be hosting Nathan Raffer with Paul Swallow, aka Christine, for the launch of Vision 2. And Nathan is here if you want to chat with him about that. But that will be tomorrow at 4 p.m. Thanks very much. Thanks to everyone who joined us online.
John's gonna take a picture. You wanna take a picture? Yeah. Oh my God, no, it was so fun. Thank you so much.